Greetings everybody, it's me, the Mick, and welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel if you're just now arriving. And today we're doing another Warhammer 40K video, where today I'm going to be talking about the Eldari, or the Eldar as the rest of the 40K universe knows them. Originally, these guys were space elves who were extremely psychically powerful, who were created during the War in Heaven between the Great Old Ones and the Catan, and they were used alongside the Krork to fight the newly formed Necron, as well as the Catan leaders that they had behind them. Eventually, they were successful in abating the Necron threat. However, the Great Old Ones were still slain, and after the Necron went to sleep and the Krork fucked off and suddenly became the Orc, the Eldari actually spread across what we know as the known galaxy, at least from the Imperium's standpoint. They did this because they developed semi-faster-than-light travel. It's actually faster than light travel, but it's a little different than jumping into hell like the Imperium does. They created the Webway, which is a giant labyrinth that is made in a pocket dimension between the Materium and the Immaterium, aka real space and the warp. And they used this labyrinth to travel between all of their different worlds and home worlds and craft worlds, and also had cities and places and locations within the Webway that they used for communicating, living, selling goods and services, what a normal race would use any type of society for. Now, a quick aside before I get into the next portion of it, being psychically attuned in the Warhammer 40K universe and being emotionally present and having very strong emotions that tie into your psychic abilities tie you directly into the warp or the immaterium, or however anybody says it within the Warhammer 40K universe. The warp, even though I've covered this in a separate video, is kind of like a world that is created of energy that does have some physical space in it, but is primarily comprised of raw emotional psychic energy, whereas the Materium is the exact opposite. It is a very physical space with very physical places and distances that has pockets and little siphons of energy and energetic, emotionally charged psychic places. This is important because the Eldar were so psychically powerful that during this time, when the warp was relatively quiet, they were so psychically powerful that their souls were able to come back from the warp, and they were able to reincarnate themselves into the Materium and into the Webway as either new Eldar, possessing Eldar bodies that were created, or just becoming new Eldar altogether. And so they were practically immortal as it was, with extremely long lifespans, but now they were pretty much functionally immortal, because even if they died, they could just come back with all of their sanity and memories intact, so they didn't even have to worry about death. After several thousands, if not millions of years of this going on, of course the Eldar became extremely full of themselves, just like any elf fantasy race would, and after a little bit too much hubris and one too many blood orgies, and that is not me making shit up, they birthed a chaos god known as Slaanesh, or to the Eldar, She Who Thirsts. And for some reason, this really pissed off Slaanesh, as well as ripped apart the entire universe. Not entirely, but it practically ripped it in half, with giant openings into the warp opening up all throughout the known galaxy, infecting worlds and planets. Now, not only did this cause havoc to all of the other sentient races within the galaxy of Warhammer 40K, but it also killed a bunch of Eldar, which Slaanesh then promptly consumed, but it also destroyed a lot of the Webway. Now, it didn't kill all of them who were still in the Webway or who were within the epicenter of Slaanesh's big first birthday party. In fact, a lot of them heard about this through psychic waves from the warp and from the Immaterium that Slaanesh was coming, and these Eldar were known as the Anari, and they left on the craft worlds, which are big, giant, continent-sized ships that the Eldar would use to travel from place to place, but also could be connected through the Webway, because again, it's not necessarily a physical place, it's more of a labyrinth that can shift and move. If you ever read that book in Percy Jackson, it kind of seems to function a lot like that. Physical spaces that still exist within a place that's not necessarily fully physical. Now again, For some reason, Slaanesh wants all of the Eldar dead, and wants to feed on all of the Eldar's souls, and each subgroup of the Eldar have their own ways of keeping themselves safe from that threat of being consumed by Slaanesh, because Slaanesh is constantly hunting the Eldar and trying to get to them both in the warp as well as in the material plane. Slightly outside of this, though, there are the Asari Outcasts. They deserve their own video, just like pretty much every one of these sub-races or subgroups, if you will, of Eldar deserve. But they're kind of like space elf pirates. They're not quite the good guys, they're not quite the bad guys. They just didn't feel like following the Asari way of life, but they're also not necessarily as dark as the Jakari. Speaking of the Asari, they're the ones who actually got the message from the warp that said, hey, you need to get out of Dodge, you need to change your ways, and you need to do better. You know, stop it. Get some help. So they jumped into as many craft worlds as they possibly could and left all of it behind and all of the homeworlds of the Eldar. And all of these craft worlds are connected by the Webway, which is a good thing because for the most part they can still communicate and trade and have some semblance of order in between them. But it's also bad because the Webway is now crawling with the Jakari, which is the other subgroup of the Eldari. So unlike the Asari who follow the Asari path, which is a very strict way of believing, thinking, and living that these Eldar use in order to stay away from Slaanesh, as well as the use of soul stones that absorb the dead souls of fallen Eldar that can be placed in other bodies, armor, machines, and buildings in order to be used later. In fact, the Asari also have a giant vault of soul stones of all the different Eldar who have passed that aren't ready to be either put in a new body or given a new function. The Jakari have a complete opposite and different way of doing things. Instead of repenting for their sins and trying to keep Big Papa She Who Thirsts away from them, they decided to just lean heavily into the torture, the mayhem, the debauchery, and the disgusting. Whereas the Asari are basically like the devout Catholic Christians. Think of these as what those Christians painted the pagan heathens that they were trying to eliminate are. In fact, all they do is torture people who have souls powerful enough to leave an imprint on the warp in order to basically distract Slaanesh and all Slaaneshi demons from trying to find them. Now again, since Eldar are the most psychically powerful beings that we know of in the Warhammer 40K universe, obviously they have the largest imprint on the warp. So the Jakari are not above kidnapping other Eldar and making them torture subjects. In fact, there's so many subgroups of the Jakari that I could spend about 45 minutes just talking about them, but we're not going to do that today. Just know that the Jakari basically leaned into and just didn't learn anything from the birth of Slaanesh, except that cruelty is going to win the day, and everything we did wasn't done wrong, we just didn't do it enough. The next subgroup of the Eldar is the Harlequins. Not this type of Harlequin, and not quite this type of Harlequin, though a lot more similar to this type of Harlequin. No, we're talking about this type of Harlequin, which is the Eldar Harlequin. These Eldar are the guardians of the Black Library. They are also worshippers of the laughing god of the Eldari. Now you might be wondering, what is this laughing god's name? I have it written down, I've seen it typed, I've heard people say it, I still can't pronounce it, but we're going to try it one time. Karoth. And that's probably wrong, but regardless, just understand that they mix disgustingly accurate and terrifyingly fast movement and melee abilities, along with somehow being these badass traveling bards. Their whole job not just to protect the Black Library, which is the entire accumulation of all Eldar knowledge on the warp and the manipulation of the warp and the Chaos Gods. They also teach the mythological cycle of the Eldar race to all of the Eldar. And they're one of the only sub-factions that can actually move between the different groups of the Eldar freely and of their own free will. Altogether, in my personal opinion, the Harlequins are probably the most interesting, and they'll probably get their own video, along with another group of Eldar that I might do side by side with them, but we'll do that for a later one. But they're actually really, really cool, and I do like the lore behind them and their function within Eldar society, that it's kind of learn from our past mistakes and try and do better, or at least at the bare minimum, do different. Next up, we have the Exodites. Now, the Exodites also decided to fuck off out of wherever the Eldar were having their planetary blood orgies before Slaanesh popped out and said, "Y'all are mine now." And instead of being on the craft worlds now, they actually live on what they call maiden worlds, which is worlds that are completely devoid of any type of sentient species that has currently colonized that world. And they tie themselves to the world's spirit. And they do that by basically attuning themselves psychically to these planets and to these worlds, which then they join together with the spirit of the world, and that is how they save themselves from being devoured by Slaanesh. You can also think of these Exodites as the Amish space elves, because they believe that through hardship and leading rough and rugged lives, mostly devoid of any type of hardcore space age technology, it kind of purifies their soul and leaves less of an imprint or a footprint that Slaanesh then can find, and it's also, again, a repentant way of their sins. So it's like a religious cult, but not quite a religious cult. But it's a religious cult. The Anari, on the other hand, which is the last subgroup we'll talk about, are considered the Reborn. And these Eldari are super religious and follow one specific Eldar god, and that is Ynid, which is the Eldar god of death. I'm not going to get into the fact that the Eldar also have their separate sect of gods outside of the Chaos gods, which is the closest thing to any type of godlike being, at least that I'm aware of, that we see in the Warhammer 40K universe. In fact, one of their healing gods is actually kidnapped by Nurgle and lives in his cauldron to have all of his diseases tested and all of his plagues tested, because if it can make her sick, it can make anyone sick. Check out my Nurgle video and you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, Ynid is partially awakened, and I'm not 100% sure what that means, but I think it might be type of a second coming type thing. But they prophesize that if he is fully awakened, then he will kill and banish Slaanesh so that the Eldar can go back to ruling the galaxy and no longer have to worry about having their souls siphoned, stealed, and devoured by Slaanesh. They are led by a person named Ivrain, which actually works side by side with Robot Girlyman, and she is known as the Daughter of Shade. So she is kind of tentatively working with the Imperium, and it's probably going to be the subsect that you hear about the most, since she is working directly with the best boy Blueberries. Now, when these Eldar die, their souls are conjoined with Ynid and are part of the reawakening process of Ynid, which is why they don't really have to worry about whether or not Slaanesh is going to devour their souls, because they are sending those souls directly to Ynid for him to feed off of so that he may finally be awakened in kind of less a devouring type way, but a building up type way to get that Eldar god to be awoken. Overall, a 15-minute video is not going to ever do any of the Eldari justice, and honestly, as much as I dislike space elves with psychic powers, they are a very interesting group, and I've actually decided that I may end up painting a bunch of homunculus Eldar, which are a super cool subsect of Eldar that I might be covering in the next video, maybe alongside the Harley Quinn Eldar. But overall, that's the end of the video. Please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Consider hitting the subscribe button if you want to see more of this or be notified whenever I upload. Also, if you don't like the video, give it a thumbs down, but comment below how I can make it better or anything I can do to improve the quality of the video. Another thing, too, is leave a comment down below for anything else you'd like me to cover, whether it's Warhammer 40K related, Star Wars, or any other type of nerdy thing, or any games you'd like to see me play. Thank you again all so much for watching, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.